We continue now at the top of Daf Metzia Daf in Meseches Bava Metzia. This is Bava Metzia Daf 49b. On the previous summer, there was a story with somebody who bought sesame, and then the sesame went up in value. Now, initially, the Gemara presented that story as having to do with Mishapara. It had to do with the fact that the seller was reneging. But then the Gemara says that Ravina says, no, one of the Rabbanan told me the story actually happened with him, and the story did not happen that way at all. What actually happened was somebody came to this one of the Rabbanan on Erev Shabbos, and he said, do you have sesame that I could buy? And the story continues, Amri Leilo. So the Rabbanan says, I said to him, no, I don't have sesame. Amar Lisa, then he said to me, can you take my money as a deposit because it's getting dark, Shabbos is coming. So Amri Lisa, then I said to him, the house is in front of you. So he said, the house is in front of you, you can place it in my house. So so the person did put it in the house, and then it got stolen. That's actually what happened. It had nothing to do with reneging on a deal or the price of the sesame going up. What simply happened was the person asked for a place to deposit the money, and he said, my house is in front of you. The person placed the money in the house and it got stolen. That's the case that came before Rava. Also, Lakame de Rava, he came before Rava, meaning to say the person came before Rava, said he wanted his money back because it wasn't watched properly. Amar Le, so Rava said to him, Kol ha-beisa kamach, when somebody says the house is before you, so lomi boy shomer sacher de lohava, not only is that person not considered a shomer sacher, elafilu shomer chinam nami lohava, he's not even a shomer chinam. He has no responsibilities whatsoever, even in terms of negligence. And so that's essentially what Rava ruled. That's why Rava said that this one of the Rabbanan was not responsible. Now the Gemara continues, Amri Le, so I said to him, when I heard over this version of the story, I was confused because Va'amru Le Rabbanan l'Rava iboy le l'kabuli alem mishapara, because the story really concluded on the previous Amud. The original story with the sesame concluded that the Rabbanan said to Rava, well, isn't there a mishapara? Now if he said, isn't there a mishapara, that sounds like there was some reneging going on, something like that, and in this version of the story, there's no reneging. V'amar Li, so then he said to me, Lo hayu devar mi'olam, that's not true. That part of the story was never really part of the story. Again, this is the correct version of the story. And Rashi explains, Amri Le, I said to him, Amru Le Rabbanan l'Rava, didn't the Rabbanan say to Rava, this is Ravina Amar Lohamilsa, this is now Ravina talking, he heard over this story, this new version of the story, and so then Ravina says, Amarti Lo Lahume Rabbanan, I said over to this one of the rabbis who was giving me this new version of the story, and the story involved him, I said, Hechi Amr, Delav Chazaras Mekachum Emkeru, how can you say the story did not involve reneging on a sale? V'Amru Le Rabbanan l'Rava, Boile Lekabel Mishapar, didn't the Rabbanan say to Rava at the end of the story that there should be a Mishapar over here? And the response was, no, that was never actually part of the story. That was a mistake. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, Kol shah kesef biyado, yado alu halyona v'chulu, anyone who has the money, so he has the upper hand. What Rabbi Shimon was saying was, if you have a situation where the buyer gives the seller the money, the seller now has the upper hand, he is able to retract, but the buyer is not able to retract. That was Rabbi Shimon's opinion. And the Gemara says, Tanya, we learned in a brayso, so Amar Rabbi Shimon says, Eimosai, when is this true? Bizman shah kesef v'hapeiros biyad mocher. That's if the money and the produce is in the hands of the seller, as we said. In that situation, again, the seller is able to retract, the buyer is not. Aval kesef biyad mocher, but if the money is in the hands of the mocher, upeiros biyad lokeach, and the fruits are in the hands of the lokeach, so that has also transferred to the lokeach, then eino yachol lachzor bo, then he's not able to retract, mimnei shekasbo biyado, because the money is in his hands. And so essentially what the Bryce is saying is that in that situation where the money was given to the seller and the produce was given to the buyer, so then there's no retracting. Now the Gemara interrupts and says, biyado, what do you mean that it's in his hand, that the money is in his hand? Biyad mocher, the money is not in the hands of the lokeach, the money here is in the hands of the mocher, it's in the hands of the seller. And so the Gemara says, ella, rather what it means is, mipnei shedemei kaspo biyado, it means because what he purchased is now in his hands. Meaning the Bryce is saying again, that if the seller has the money and the lokeach has the objects, so then there is no retracting, because demei kaspo biyado, because what the lokeach bought is now in the possession of the lokeach. Now the Gemara asks Pshita. The Gemara says, well, if that's the case, it's obvious. What the Bryce is essentially saying is that if the Lokeach did a Meshicha on the items he's buying, so the deal is finalized. We know the deal is finalized through Meshicha. What kind of Chiddush exactly is this in the Bryce? And so the Gemara answers that we're talking about a very particular case in the Bryce where we're saying no one can retract. Amar Rava says, Hacha b'mayaskin, and here the case is as follows. Kigon shahoisa aliyah shel Lokeach. The case is that the Lokeach's aliyah, his upper floor, muskeres biad mocher, is actually rented to the mocher. mocher. So it's not that the lokach actually has the produce. It's that the produce is in the area of the mocher, but the mocher is just renting that location from the lokach. The mocher is renting the place, but it's really the lokach's. And so the lokach doesn't actually have the produce in his possession because he rented out his space. He rented out that upper floor, but it is technically in his house, which he's renting out to the mocher. And the Gemara now explains why in that particular scenario, we say that the deal is finalized just because the money went already from the buyer to the seller. Because Taima Mai Takinu Rabbanan Meshicha, what's the reason why the Rabbanan said you have to do a Meshicha in order to finalize the deal? That's Gezeira Shema Yomar Lo Nisrafu Chitech Be'aliyah. We're afraid it's a Gezeira. Maybe the seller will say to the buyer, oh, I can't give you the wheat. It all got burned on the upper floor. That's a concern we have, and therefore we say a deal should not be finalized until the product actually goes to the Lokayach. But over here, where it's really technically Birishuse de Lokayach Ninu, it's really in the Rishus of the Lokayach. Now, it can't make a kinyan. That Rishus can't make a kinyan on behalf of the Lokayach because he rented it out to the Mocher, but it is technically his Rishus, and therefore we're not concerned with a fire. Because Inafla Deleka Ba'onis, if a fire does happen by accident, we are certain that the Lokayach will take care of it and get the fruits from there, because again, that's really his property. And the Gemara continues, how Gavra Diyav Zuze Achamra, there was a person who gave money, he wanted to buy wine. Lasov Shama de Kaboy Laminsave de Be Parzik Rofila. Then he heard that this is a person named Be Parzik, he was an officer of the king, and he was going to try to take this wine. So the person said, forget this deal, this Be Parzik is going to take away the wine anyway. So Amar Le, so he said to him, Havli Zuze, he said, give me my money back. Lo Baina Chamra, I don't want the wine anymore. Asa Lakami de Rav Chisda, came before Rav Chisda. Amar Le said to him, Kederach Shetiknu Mashicha B'mochen, just like Mashicha was instituted on behalf of, for the benefit of the seller, that the seller can retract if there was no Mashicha, Kach Tiknu Mashicha B'Lakucho. So too, it's a benefit to the Lokach as well. Only through Mashicha is the deal finalized, and therefore this individual is in fact allowed to renege in this situation. And Rashi explains, Amosai, again, when is it true, Yesh Chazar B'Dover, when is it true, according to Rav Shimon, that there is an ability to retract? Bizman Sha'kesef U'Peiros B'Yada Mocher. Again, if the Mocher has both the money and the produce, the Yochel Mocher L'Achzer Bo, again, then the seller can retract. Ukminu Rabbanan B'Reshusei L'Chazar. The Rabbanan say he has that ability to retract. Ki Hechi D'Litrach V'Leitzel. That way, since he has the ability to retract, so he's going to go, he'll save it just in case you have a situation where a fire breaks out. Memnei Sha'kasbo B'Yado, because the money is in his hands, so in that situation, there's no retracting. Again, that's what the Brisa said in a case where the Lokach has the produce. Now Rashi just says, Mashma Lokach Kibo Kfar Kasbo. It sounds like it's saying that the buyer has the money. That's not really true. We were talking about where the seller has the money. So the Gemara then said what it means is that the buyer has what he was buying with the money. And Rashi continues, then the Gemara asks Pshita, well, that's obvious. Hare Mashicha, if you already did a Mashicha on the items, Yesh, so then you have this Mashicha. Ve'afilu Rabbanan Modu. Then everybody agrees, of course, it's finalized. And then the Gemara answered, Muskeres Biyad Mocher. We're talking about a scenario, a particular scenario, where the location was being rented by the seller. So the fruits technically are in the possession of the lokayach. But he can't do a kinyan chotzer on the peiros by giving the money to kaven the kibel haschar, because since already he got rent from the seller, nikna hamakam lamocher. So the place really is in the possession of the mocher technically. Kol yemei haschir, it's all the time that he's renting it. V'chatzer shel mocher, in terms of kinyan chotzer, it's the chotzer of the seller. El Rabbi Shimon islay mos konus devar toar. However, Rabbi Shimon holds already in a doraisa level, money really can create a kinyan. I mean, like we said, u'mashicha takanta de rabbanan. The idea that you need mashicha, that's just from the rabbanan. V'achalo itzrich takanta. Here we don't need the takana, where it's really the lokach's location, the time of my tikkun rabbanan v'chulu. Because again, what was the whole reason we even instituted mashicha, etc. Inami shematipo logaris. They don't have shematipo ala lishna achrinahu v'hihi. It's a different language, and that is it. Parzik shem hasar. Again, then we had a story of Parzik is the name of the officer. Rofila Mishnah Lamelech. He was an officer of the king, and we said, according to Rav Chisda, just like we said that the seller has the ability, if there was no mashicha, to retract, so too the buyer has that same ability. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Ha'ona arba kesef me'esrim v'arba kesef lasela. Ona is considered 4 silver ma'ah from 24 silver ma'ah per sela. Shesus lamekach. The idea is that it's 1/6 of the purchase, meaning to say, let's say the buyer pays more by 1/6. That's what's called ona. That means he was overcharged, and vice versa with regards to the seller. Ad masai mutter lahachzir. Now, until when does the person have the opportunity to return, to go back on the sale if there was ona? Ad kadeshayira latagar o lekrovo, and said it so that he has enough time to show the item to a merchant or to his relative to find out if he was overcharged. Hora Rabbi Tarfon belud. Rabbi Tarfon taught in Lud. Ha'ona shmona kesef may esr v'arba kesef lasela. Ona is actually 8 kesef for every 24 kesef per sela. Shlish lamekach, which is 1/3 of the mekach. Essentially, it's more. It allows the seller to charge more. V'samchu tagari Lud. So the merchants of Lud, they were happy when they heard the opinion of Rabbi Tarfon. But Amar lahem. But then he said to them, Kol hayom muter lachzer, that the buyer has all day to retract. He has more time to retract. So Amru lo. So they said to him, Yaniach lanu Rabbi Tarfon bimkomenu. Let Rabbi Tarfon leave us where we were before. V'chazru l'divrei chachamim, will return to the opinion of the chachamim. And Rashi explains, Honar ba kesef, Ona is 4 silver. Rashi says Ma'os kesef. We're talking about Ma'os of silver, Sheim Sheish Bedinar, which are 6 per dinar. Me Esr v'arba kesef lasela, and it's from 24 kesef lasela, means to say, Em hoya hamekach b'dmei hasela. If the thing being bought, it costs 1 sela, shu chav daled mos, which is 24 mos, so the Ona is going to be 4 out of 24. The hashta hava Ona, shasus lamekach, it comes out that Ona is 1/6 of the purchase price. He's going to have to return to him whatever the Ona was, whatever the overcharge was, he's going to have to return to him those 4 kesef. Ad mosai muter lahachzer misha nisana. Now the person, let's say, who was overcharged, how much time does he have? V'hadanakat lashon muter, and the reason why it says the language of muter, lashminan deleka afilu misha para lahachzer hamekach o sheyitin lo na'aso. It comes to teach that there's not even a misha para to return the mekach. Let's say he wants to go back on the purchase, or he has to give him back his Ona. There's not going to be a mishapara in that situation, because again, normally if you renege on your word on the deal that you made, that's a mishapara. You get the curse of the mishapara. That doesn't apply if you're going back on the terms if there was Ona. And Rashi continues, Ad kadei sheyira hamekach l'tagra o le'echad mikrovav. He has enough time to show it to a merchant or to one of his relatives. V'imsha yoser machal al Ona also. If he waits longer than that, then he's already forgiven the Ona. He's forgiven the overcharging. V'samchu tagari Lud. The merchants of Lud were happy with Rabbi Tarfon's opinion. Shayu bekin b'schoro mochen b'yoker, because they knew how to sell, and they were able to sell at a high price. And so therefore they were happy that Rabbi Tarfon said it's up to 1/3, but then when Rabbi Tarfon said that he's going to give the buyer more time, they said they'd rather go back to the opinion of the Chachamim. And the Gemara says, Itmar, it was stated the following, Machlokas Amoroim, Rav Amar Shesus Mekach Shaninu. Rav says, when we talk about 1/6 being Ona, it's a 6 of what is being purchased. The Gemara will explain. Ushmuel Amar, and Shmuel says, Shesus Mos Nami Shaninu. There's another way to calculate the 6 as well, and that would be by the amount of money that is given. That also is a valid way of calculating the 6 according to Shmuel. Shmuel agrees with what Rav is saying about Shesus Mekach, but he's adding the concept of Shesus Mos, as the Gemara now explains. Shavi Shisa Bechamsha. Let's say you have something that was worth 6, and it sells it for 5, so that's 1/6 off. It's being sold for 1/6 less. Or Shavi Shisa B'Shiva, let's say it was worth 6, and instead it's sold for 7. Essentially, the seller is overcharging in that case. That's also clearly 1/6. That's 1/6 of what the product is worth. So Kuli Almalo Pligi Debasar Mekach Hazlinon, everybody agrees that we follow the purchase of what it should have been, the item that's being purchased of what it is actually worth. V'Ona having, it's considered to be Ona. Now the halacha by Ona is, if it's exactly 1/6, so then the buyer can say, let's say the buyer overpaid by 1/6, he can demand back that extra amount, that 1/6. Now keep pligi. Now what's the machlokas between Rav and Shmuel? That's shavi chamsha b'shisa. The machlokas is, let's say the item is worth 5, and then he sells it for 6, so he's overcharging 1. Now if you look at the 5 from the perspective of what the item is worth, that's actually adding 1/5. 1/5 of 5 is the one that's added, and he's paying 6. But if we look at what he's paying, so it's 1/6. That's why over here the question is, do we look at what he's paying? Or you can go the other way, v'shavi shiva b'shisa. Let's say it was worth 7, but the person sells it for a cheaper price. He sells it for 6. So again, that 1 less is going to be 1/6 of what the person paid, but it's going to be 1/7 of what the item is worth, and that's why the Gemara now explains. L'shmuel da'amar basar mos azlin, and according to Shmuel, who says we also follow the payment to determine if it's a 6th. So idi v'idi ona havin, in these cases as well. In both examples we just gave, it's a case of ona, and let's say the buyer overpaid, we can call that exactly 1/6, and the buyer can say he wants back that extra 1/6 that he paid. L'rav da'amar basar mekach azlin, but according to Rav, who says we don't care about what he paid, we care about what the item is worth. So now it works out differently. Shavi chamsha b'shisa. Let's say, for example, the item is worth 5 and the buyer paid 6. So there he actually paid 1/5 more if we look at the item. So bittul mekach hava. So that's considered to be a bittul mekach. That's considered to be he was so overcharged. He was overcharged overcharged by a fifth and not a sixth, and therefore the whole sale is actually nullified. And in the other case, shavi shiva b'shisa, in a case where it's worth 7 and it's sold for 6. So again, if you look at what it's worth, that's just going to be a 1/7 difference, and that's already mechila have that already will be forgiven. That would not be considered ona according to Rav. And the Gemara continues, Shmuel Amar, and Shmuel says, Ki amrinan mechila uvitel mekach. When do we say that it's so little that we consider it forgiven, or that it's so much that we say it's a bitul mekach, that the whole sale is nullified? That's heicha delekes shasus mishnei tzdadim. That's if you don't have 6 from both directions. It's not a 6 from the perspective of the item, and it has to not be a 6th from the perspective of what was paid. Aval heicha deika shasus mitzad echad. But if you have a 6th even from one side, either from the item or from what was paid, then we consider it exactly a 6th, and onah have it's considered to be onah. And the Gemara continues, Tanan, we learned in the Mishnah, Ha'onah dalid kesef me'esrim v'arba kesef l'sela. Onah is 4 kesef out of 24 kesef. Shasus lemekach, that is 1/6. And the Gemara says, my lav is it not? The zavin shavi esrim be'esrim v'arba. The case the Mishnah is talking about is the item is worth 20, and it's sold for 24, meaning the seller is charging too much. And how does that work out to a 6th? Ushmami, no, we see from that, shasus mos nami shanina, that when you're calculating the 6th, you can also calculate the 6th from the amount that's paid. You don't have to calculate from what the item is worth, and that seems to be a proof for Shmuel that again shasus mos also counts. And the Gemara says, lo, no, the zavin shavi esrim v'arba bi'esrim, that the case actually is it was worth 24 and he sold it for too little. He sold it for 20, and then we're actually looking at what the item is worth in terms of determining the 1/6. And the Gemara says, well, according to that, minisana, so who's getting the onah? Who's the one that is wronged in this transaction? It's the mocher, it's the seller. But the Gemara says, if that's the case, ema seifa. Now look at the end of the Mishnah. It says at the end of the Mishnah, ad masai mutter lahachzir. How long does the person have to go back on the deal? Bechdei sheyira latagro lokrovu. He has to have enough time to show it to the merchant or his relative. Now, who's that talking about? It should be talking about the seller, according to what we just said, but that's not true. V'yamar Rav Nachman, because Rav Nachman said, lo shanu ela lokeach. It's the lokeach that we give this amount of time, this limited amount of time. We say that he only has the amount of time to show it to the merchant or his relative. Avol mocher liolim choser, but Rav Nachman says that the seller, he has forever to retract. And so therefore, all of a sudden over here, this line is clearly talking about the lokeach. And so the Gemara therefore says, ella, rather, you have to say, what does the Mishnah mean? It means the zavin shavi esrim v'arba, that the item was worth 24, and he sold it be'esrim utmanya. He sold it for 28. So again, you're looking at the 24. What's 1/6 of 24? That's adding 4, and he sold it for 28, and it is the lokeach in this case who overpaid. And the Gemara continues, Tanan, we learned in the Mishnah, Hori Rabbi Tarfon belud. Rabbi Tarfon taught in Lud, Ha'onah shmona kesef, me'esrim v'arba kesef l'sela, that onah is 8 out of 24, shlish lamekach, that is 1/3 of the purchase. And the Gemara says, my lav is it not? The zavin shavi shitzeri be'esrim v'arba, that the case is it was worth 16, and then he sold that for 24. And the idea is, again, 16 plus 8 is 24, but we're looking at the 24, we're looking at what was paid. Ushmami na shlish mos, nami and you see that you can calculate the third from what's actually paid. You don't have to calculate the third from what the item is worth. And the Gemara again says, lo, no, the zavin shavi esrim v'arba b'shitzar. It's the other way around. He sells something that is worth 24 for 16. The Gemara says again, if that's the case, minisana. So who's the one that is wronged in this transaction? It's the mocher. It's actually the mocher, the seller. He sold it for too little. But the Gemara says, according to that, ema seifa. Now let's look at the end of the Mishnah again. Amar lahem kol hayom muter lachzer. He said to them that the person who was wronged has all day to retract. V'yamar Rav Nachman, and Rav Nachman said on that, lo shanu ela lokeach. That's talking about the buyer. Avol mocher liolam choser, but the mocher has forever to go back on the deal. And so you see clearly we're talking about the lokeach. And so the Gemara instead says, ela, rather, you have to say, what's the Mishnah mean? To zavin shavi chavdalid betlasanu train, that the item was worth 24 and he sold it for 32. We're taking 1/8 of the 24, and we're saying we're going to add, we're taking rather 1/3 of the 24, and we're saying we're going to add 8, and he actually sold it for 32. And the Gemara continues, Tanya Kavasi de Shmuel. We have a brisa that supports Shmuel. Rashi explains, Tanya Kavasi de Shmuel, Devein Shasus Mekach, Bein Shasus Mos. Again, Shmuel says that the 6 can be calculated either in terms of the item, the value of the item, or it can be calculated in terms of what was paid. And the brisa says, Mishahutal Olav. What that means, says Rashi, Mishahutal Olav, Misha Ha'onah Olav. Whoever the onah is upon, meaning Misha Nisana, whoever was, let's say, the buyer, if he was overcharged, or let's say the seller, if he sold it for too little, whoever that person is, whoever that party is, Yado Al Yona, that party has the upper hand. And the Brisa says, Ketzad, how so? Machar lo shove hey bevav. Let's say he sells him something worth 5, but he sells it to him for 6. And so in this case, he overcharges. The buyer is the one. Minasana, who's the one that the ona is upon? It's the lokeach. It's upon the buyer. The buyer paid too much. So we say, Yad lokeach al halion. And we say that in this case, the lokeach has the upper hand. Rotza omer tein li ma'osai. If he wants, he could say, give me all my money back. O tein li masho nisani. Or he could also say, give me whatever you overcharged me. In this case, he overcharged by 1. And another example, machar lo, let's say he sells to him, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Nun Amud Aleph.